Welcome to the Frequency Labyrinth. I am Adrienne McDonald, your host. This podcast is for you if you're done with surface level self-help and ready for something deeper and actually transformative. Around here, we work with ancient wisdom, human design, gene keys, and shamanic practices, not as knowledge to collect, but as tools to live by. This isn't about one size fits all. It's about learning to work with your energy, your design, and your life. This is about integration and embodiment. We go deep here with ancient wisdom, practical integration, so that you can develop ironclad self-trust. Let's get into it. Hello, beautiful humans, and welcome back to the Frequency Labyrinth podcast. We're going to be going over the solar eclipse in Leo today. I'm going to be breaking down the cosmic mix, giving you 3 things to watch for, and some insight into the human design profile lines and what you can do with the energy mix. So if you've been listening this month, you know I've declared this molting season. Mostly because I feel like everyone was talking about shedding, and apparently I wanted a different spin. But I think molting is genuinely a better metaphor for eclipse season and what it can feel like, especially this one. Because, you know, a crab doesn't leave its shell because the shell suddenly becomes bad. It leaves because, well, it grew. And, earlier this month, I think I also talked about that strange in-between period where the old shell is coming off and the new one hasn't really hardened yet. And now, you know, we're really into the eclipse season. So I think that there's another part of the process. Eventually, there has to be a separation. You can know that you've outgrown something for a very long time, and you still keep trying to make yourself fit inside of it. And the solar eclipse perfects on Wednesday, August 12th at 20 degrees Leo. And I feel like there's several different things converging around sort of a similar idea. And we have this conjunct the South Node by sign. We have the eclipse falling in the 3rd decan of Leo, which is a double Mars ruled decan associated with the 7 of Wands in Tarot. In human design, the sun and the moon will be moving through Gate 4, the Gate of Formalization, whose gene keys move from intolerance to understanding to forgiveness. Saturn is also in retrograde in Aries, and it's going to be trining this eclipse. And you know, Mercury has joined Jupiter and Leo, and Venus has now moved into Libra. And then sitting underneath all of this is Lughnasadh, the Celtic festival marking the beginning of harvest season. So there's a lot going on here. But the more, you know, I've been sitting with all these pieces, and obviously, this is not like a traditional new moon conversation because it is eclipse season. And, you know, the whole, what am I manifesting next that's not the move here. So I've been thinking about what's ripened enough to be harvested and what you're still fighting to keep alive after you've already received what it came here to give you. Because harvest and severing actually belong together. You know, when you harvest something, you're acknowledging that a growing cycle has reached a certain level of maturity. You take what the field has produced, and eventually you clear the field. You don't need to decide that the entire growing season was a mistake simply because you're no longer standing in the same crop, right? I think that there's a part that gets lost in the way we talk about endings, particularly in spiritual spaces, where everything we're leaving suddenly becomes something that, quote unquote, no longer serves us. And, you know, there's some truth to that, but there's also the hey, some of it served you extremely well. Some of it was exactly what you needed at the time. Some of it you loved. Sometimes you fought like hell for it, which is where the Seven of Wands, I feel, is coming in and starts asking a very interesting question in this conversation. And maybe the question isn't whether something served you. The question maybe is whether the season is complete. And I think that's a much harder thing to recognize because, when you have anger, it makes endings pretty straightforward. It was something obviously terrible. We're usually not sitting around contemplating its spiritual significance, right? The complicated endings are the ones where we can see the harvest and we know what the relationship gave us. We know what the career choice made possible. We know how maybe some beliefs or identities protected us. We know why we made the choices that we did. And we may even understand another person's behavior far better than we once did. But somewhere along the way, maybe we are confusing understanding with an obligation to keep tolerating something now that we understand, right? So I feel like this is where Gate 4 comes into this eclipse season, because its movement from intolerance to understanding to forgiveness suggests something more than, it's a much more nuanced conversation than something is reaching a breaking point, which I'm not saying that there's not stuff like that going on during eclipse season too. There certainly is. I've seen a lot of it in the last couple of weeks. But there are things that we tolerate when we don't fully see the pattern. We explain them away, accommodate them, compromise around them, or convince ourselves that something will eventually change until enough of life happens and enough evidence accumulates that we can no longer pretend we don't understand what we're looking at. Okay? And understanding may actually make us more compassionate while simultaneously making our boundaries much more clear. And forgiveness doesn't necessarily mean reconciliation or another chance. Sometimes it means that we simply no longer need the past to become different before we're willing to stop participating or living in it. So I think a question I want to use as our starting point for this eclipse is, what if you understood well enough that you no longer need to keep defending, explaining, fixing, or caring? Now, let's talk about this decan for a minute, because I think the Seven of Wands also gives us another interesting way of looking at this eclipse. Leo is a fixed fire sign. It's ruled by the sun. So we tend to associate it with creativity and visibility and vitality and pride and leadership and the willingness to fully inhabit who we are. Signs aren't monoliths. Each sign is divided into 3 sections called decans, and this eclipse falls at the 20 degrees of Leo, putting it right at the beginning of the 3rd decan. And as I said, this particular decan has a strong Mars signature, and the corresponding tarot card is the Seven of Wands. Now, if you know the card in the Rider deck, there's a figure standing on higher ground holding 1 wand while 6 other wands rise towards him from below. Now, we don't see people holding those other wands. We actually don't know what's going on beneath him, right? We don't know exactly what he's fighting for, but we do know, or we can look at the card and go, okay, it looks like he's defending his position. He's already gained the higher ground, and now he has to sort of decide what he's willing to do to keep it. And I think if memory serves correct, even the shoes don't match on that card, which is kind of always been a little weird and chaotic. But he looks like someone who got called into battle before he had time to sort of properly prepare for it. That's the vibe I get. And I think the classic interpretation of this card is, focus on standing on your ground, defend what you've earned, refuse to back down, have the courage to face opposition. And all of that certainly belongs to this card, and I don't want to turn it into a card about giving up simply because we're dealing with the South Node eclipse. But there's things that are absolutely worth fighting for. There's boundaries that need defending. There's moments where holding your ground is exactly what you need to do, especially if you spend a lifetime giving away ground because everyone else, that was a contract that you made in your childhood, people pleasing, etc. But the Seven of Wands, I feel like, also raises a different question, is around, and that specifically around this particular eclipse, with it being so close to the South Node, is what happens when you've been defending the same ground for so long that you don't even know why you're doing it anymore. The defense itself becomes part of your identity. And, it's really easy to do that. You fight incredibly hard to build a career, and somewhere along the way, the person that you fought for that career becomes part of who you are. You fight to save a relationship, and eventually all the effort you've invested becomes another reason why you can't imagine leaving it. You fight to prove that you can make your business work, and that you can take care of everyone, and that you can survive something, and that you can succeed on your own. And that decision you made 10 years ago was really the right decision at the time. At first you're defending something you value, and eventually you may find yourself defending the fact that you've been defending it, right? It's like this vortex. And I feel like that's where Mars can get tricky, because Mars knows how to mobilize, it knows how to take action, give Mars an obstacle, and it has somewhere to put its energy. Give it to something to push against, and, the mission becomes clear. And there's times I feel like that having something to fight for can make us feel incredibly alive. I mean, I've got Mars and Aries in my natal charts. I've got a lot of fire in my chart too, so I get that. But the problem comes when the fight has lasted so long that we really haven't noticed the original reason for fighting has changed, or maybe it's disappeared altogether. And because this is Leo, pride has to be part of the conversation. And I don't mean pride is like a character flaw. I think that, healthy pride is a good thing. We should be proud of what we've survived, what we've built, the risks that we've taken, the skills we've developed, and the things that we refuse to compromise on, in our value set. But pride can also make it very difficult to admit something that we fought incredibly hard for isn't what we want anymore. If I spent years telling everyone that this was the dream, what does it mean if I don't want the dream now? Or I want a different dream? If I fought to make the relationship work, what does it say about all that effort if I finally stop? If everyone knows this version of myself, what am I? Who am I if I don't keep performing it? And the South Node sitting in Leo makes those questions a lot louder, because the South Node tends to expose what we've become very good at doing. And it can show us patterns that are deeply familiar, and identities that we know how to inhabit, and strategies that worked well enough, so well actually, that we reach for them automatically. And sometimes the South Node isn't something that's obviously dysfunctional. Sometimes it's one of your greatest competencies. And that's precisely why it's so difficult to loosen our grip on it. So I wouldn't look at this eclipse and say, hey, what do I need to give up? I think that maybe looking at it too simplistically. I'd look at where your energy has been going and ask whether the return still justifies the movement, the fight, the energy. Or what are you constantly having to defend? What requires you to keep proving its value? Where are you repeatedly explaining yourself? Where are you maintaining, because stopping would force you to reconsider a decision that you once felt absolutely certain about? And if you weren't already standing on this top of this hill, would you climb it again? And that question gets like underneath the sunk cost and pride and habit and identity pretty quickly. And this Celtic festival is all about the harvest. And the harvest changes our relationship with the field. You don't harvest because, a crop was a failure. You harvest because it grew, right? The work produced something. You take what has ripened and then the field changes. It enters a different cycle. And the fact that you're no longer tending to that same crop doesn't necessarily erase the work you put into it or the nourishment that you receive from it. And I think the Seven of Wands can work the same way here. Maybe you fought for something because it genuinely deserved to be fought for at the time. Maybe becoming the person capable of standing your ground was part of the harvest. Take all of that with you. But you don't have to keep manufacturing battles in order to prove that you learned how to fight. And I think when you're enmeshed with chaos, that just, you're like, I don't know how to put down the sword. And I feel like that's where the double Mars energy becomes a little bit more interesting than be brave or stand your ground. Mars gives us the ability to sever. It can make a clean cut once a decision has actually been made. The question is, are we using that Mars to keep defending and keep fighting with those swords? Or are we finally creating enough separation to leave it? And I think that's the deeper challenge here, knowing the difference between perseverance and attachment and courage and pride, between defending something that still matters and refusing to leave a battle that you've already outgrown. Sometimes courage means holding your ground. Sometimes courage means realizing you don't need to do this anymore. Now let's bring human design into this, because Gate 4, I feel like still adds a different layer. And this gate wants to formulate answers. It wants to take a question or a problem or doubt or uncertainty and create something coherent that the mind can say, okay, this makes sense now. And if you've ever been stuck in uncertainty, you know how seductive that can be, right? We tell ourselves we'll feel better as soon as we understand what's happening, why it's happening, what it means, and preferably what we're supposed to do about it. And the shadow in this particular case around this is that we can feel forced to produce an answer before there's actually enough information to know whether the answer is correct. And that's eclipse season isn't exactly famous for handing us all the information up front. So I would be especially careful about assuming that whatever conclusion your mind reaches this week or actually this month is the final word on what's happening, right? But I think that the Gene Keys progression of intolerance and understanding of forgiveness takes us somewhere a little deeper than simply being careful about mental certainty. I think that it means maybe, someone irritates us, disappoints us, believes something different, behaves badly, and we've had enough. And that's certainly one expression of it. But there's a different kind of intolerance that feels a little bit more relevant to this eclipse. Sometimes you simply know too much to keep participating in something the same way. There are patterns that we can tolerate for years because we haven't quite connected the dots yet. We made accommodations, re-rationalized, etc. And then, like I said, those experiences pile up. And you're like, oh, And this is the reason why I don't think the intolerance underneath this may look necessarily like rage. It may sound more like, I don't want to do this anymore. And even that doesn't mean that you have to storm out the door. It could mean that you can't keep being the person who always fixes things. You can't keep pretending that you don't care about something that you care deeply about. You can't keep spending money in a way that contradicts what you say you value. You can't keep managing everyone else's reactions before you make a decision. And you can't keep telling yourself you want the thing that you've spent years working towards when some part of you deep inside is like, that's not really what I want anymore. I think this is where the forgiveness comes in and gets interesting, because we often talk about forgiveness as something we give another person. In the context of this eclipse, I think there's just as much potential for forgiving ourselves for how long it took to see something, forgiving the choices we made with the information we had, forgiving ourselves for staying, leaving, trying again, changing our minds, all the things, right? There could be an enormous amount of shame around changing our minds, particularly when we've made our choices public. That's very Leo. We announced the dream. We told everyone how much this mattered. We built an identity around it. We fought for it. And then life gave us more information. Suddenly we're standing there going, well, shit, I don't want this anymore. And Gate 4 wants to turn that into another problem to solve, because that sounds natural. It wants an explanation that makes the whole timeline neat and logical. But you know what? That's not the season that we're in. We can look at the harvest instead. You don't have to put yourself on trial. You can think about, what do you know now because you stayed as long as you did? What did you learn because you tried? What became obvious only after repetition made it obvious? Those questions sound a little bit more useful than asking whether you made the right or wrong decision, because that's rarely the case. We're complicated beings, humans are. And, I think that this is a time where you bring in your human design authority. Like if you're an emotional authority, let the wave move. If you're sacral, notice where your body is actually responding to things. If you're splenic, pay attention to what you know in the moment rather than trying to recreate things afterwards, right? With Mercury and Jupiter and Leo right now, ideas can feel really big. Conclusions can feel meaningful. We may suddenly have language for something we've been circling for months, and that can be incredibly useful. But Jupiter can also enlarge and amplify what Mercury is thinking about. So could be a little more mental chatter, right? And one realization can quickly become an entire philosophy about what your life means and what you need to do next. And that is not what you want to do during eclipse season, okay? You can understand something today and decide what to do about it later. Saturn retrograde in Aries is also trining this eclipse by sign, and that sort of reinforces this for me for sure. Saturn isn't particularly impressed by the emotional high of a breakthrough. Wants to know what remains true after you sort of let it settle in for a while. What are you willing to take responsibility for? What boundary can you actually maintain? What decisions still make sense when no one's cheering you on and the adrenaline is worn off? And then Venus in Libra, very happy that Venus is now in Libra because it got the hell out of birth. That sort of adds a relationship piece, because some of this is a greater understanding of things also changes our agreements with people, right? Sometimes the severing isn't from the person. It's from the relationship that you've been participating in. You may stop over-functioning. You may stop making yourself endlessly available. You may stop being quiet to maintain harmony. Stop assuming understanding someone means giving them unlimited access to you. And this is where all the different pieces of the eclipse start to talk to each other. None of this requires an immediate answer about what happens next. Sometimes the most important realization is simply that you can't unknow what you know now. And what you do with that understanding can unfold from there. So 3 things to watch for is, number 1, understanding something doesn't mean that you have to keep tolerating it. Many of us have been taught that a greater understanding of something should make us more accommodating. Once we understand why someone behaves the way they do, why a fixed family pattern exists, why a workplace operates the way it does, or why we've repeated a pattern ourselves, we're supposed to become more compassionate about it. And okay, maybe, but compassion doesn't create an obligation to remain available for something that we recognize isn't working. Sometimes understanding actually decreases our tolerance because we finally see a pattern clear enough to stop negotiating with it. So if something becomes a little harder to tolerate this week, pay attention before assuming that you're simply being impatient. You may be seeing something that you can no longer unsee. Number 2, don't throw away the harvest just because the season is finished. We have a strange tendency to rewrite the past when we're ready to leave something behind. That relationship was a waste of time. That career was the wrong choice. Or, you spent years pursuing a dream that and I should have been doing something else. That type of language is not helpful. The Harvest Festival is an assessment and it's accounting. What did the years produce? What did you learn about yourself? What became stronger? What do you value now because you experienced what you don't value? These are things that we only know because we've lived long enough to find out. You don't need to keep planting. You don't need to keep the field planted and blooming forever to appreciate what grew there. You gather the grain, you take the wisdom, you let the season be complete without having to make it wrong or a mistake. Number 3, pay attention to what you're still defending. The 7 of Wands and double Mars rulership make this one worth watching. There's always going to be things that are worth defending, but sometimes the amount of energy we already invested becomes the reason why we keep investing. And that's not the move here. We've spent years trying to prove something about ourselves and don't know what to do when we no longer need the proof. Before putting more energy into defending something this week, ask yourself, if I wasn't already invested in this, would I choose it again today? So with all of that said, I think that's something that you can contemplate, right? Especially the one that temptation to make the past wrong in order to give yourself permission to leave it. And revision history, I'm seeing a lot more of that lately. And that your past is part of you, right? And depending on your human design profile, you may notice this whole harvest and severing conversation showing up a little differently too. So, your profile doesn't tell you what areas of life the eclipse is activating. That's your rising sign. And if you're on my newsletter, that goes out this morning. So you will have more information in that. However, as far as your profile lines are concerned, if you got a line 1 in your profile, your instinct may be to research the hell out of whatever is happening before you feel comfortable making a move. You want foundation. You want to have an understanding of how you got here, what went wrong, what the options are, and preferably have enough information that the next step doesn't feel like you're walking on unstable ground. Okay, I get the Gate 4 may amplify that a little bit, but there's a point where gathering more information stops creating security and it starts postponing the moment when you have to trust the foundation you already built. So your eclipse question may be, do I actually need more information or do I actually have enough to acknowledge what's changed? It can also make you a little bit more down the rabbit hole. And some people with line 1 to use that as an excuse not to deal with the emotional part of things. If you've got a line 2, I'd pay attention to what you've been doing because other people expected it from you or because something comes naturally enough that everyone assumes that you'll keep doing it forever. Line 2s often have gifts that are obvious to other people before they fully recognize themselves. and being called out for those gifts can become part of the role that you occupy. The fact that you're naturally good at something doesn't mean that you owe it your life. There may be something that you've been retreating from that genuinely needs more space rather than another attempt to force yourself back into participation. So your question might be, what am I continuing because I'm good at it, even though I'm not particularly interested in it anymore? If you got a line 3, you probably don't need me to explain that sometimes I only know something's not going to work out because you've tried it enough times to find out. And that's not failure. That's how wisdom is developed. But this eclipse could bring a strange amount of mixed emotion around that. And maybe some experiments that you've been working on have run their course. And the harvest idea here is the data, right? You know where the weak point is. And the question might be, what have I tested thoroughly enough that I can finally trust the result? You've got line 4, relationships in your network. Maybe where this gets particularly interesting because so much of your life develops through people that you know and the relationships you've cultivated over time. You may realize that a particular role within your community has run its course and that maybe a friendship needs to change its shape. So your question may be, what connections are still alive and which ones am I mostly maintaining because of history? And then line 5, this eclipse could bring up expectations, projections, and roles that you've taken on because other people believe that you can solve something. Hello, fellow line 5s out there. I have been living this all months. Line 5 energy can become incredibly confident at stepping into a mess and figuring out what needs to happen, but confidence can turn into a trap when everyone keeps handing you problems because you've already proven that you can handle them. And there may be something that you've been carrying because people expect you to fix, rescue, lead, provide the answer, etc. The 7 of Wands question becomes extremely useful here. What problem am I still solving because people expect me to be the solution? And maybe you don't want to solve that. And if you have line 6, I would look at this eclipse through the lens of perspective. You know, line 6 has developed wisdom over time. This feels incredibly aligned with the harvest piece. And you may be able to appreciate what a season gave you without needing to return to it. And you may also be realizing that an identity built during an earlier phase of life no longer represents the example that you want to embody right now. So your question could be, what can I see clearly from here that I couldn't possibly have understood when I was living through it? So take all of that. And obviously, we all have 2 lines in our profile. So you can take those, mash them together, and say, what has experience taught you that you keep asking life to prove one more time, right? Because that's what's underlying here. So I think after everything we've talked about today, I think the place to begin is, what has your life already shown you? You probably don't need another sign, another conversation, or another round of the same experience to be ready to molt, right? Because you've been slowly understanding for a while. This eclipse may simply bring you to the point where the evidence that you've been gathering just becomes harder to negotiate. So give it some room. Pay attention to what's become harder to ignore. Notice where you're gearing up for a fight that you fought 100 times before. Notice where you keep searching for another explanation, even though you already know the pattern. So look at the harvest. And again, I don't want to lose all of this in the talk about the South Nodes and severing and the 7 of Wands. Look at the harvest. Whatever you're leaving behind may have given you something incredibly valuable. And the relationship may have taught you how you wanted to be loved. A career may have given you skills that you'll use for the rest of your life. The battle may have taught you that you can actually stand your ground. So take those things with you into the molting season. The shell wasn't bad. You don't need to stand over it cataloging everything was wrong with it so you can justify leaving it behind. You just don't fit in there anymore. And I think there's something incredibly freeing about allowing an ending to be that. It doesn't have to be complicated. You don't have to hate the person. You don't have to regret the years. You don't have to decide that you chose the wrong career, follow the wrong dream, wasted your time, or, should have known better. That's a good one, right? Should have known better. You can understand why you chose it, or maybe you don't understand why you chose it. You could just appreciate where it came from, forgive what needs to be forgiving, and know that the season is complete. And that may be the real severing underneath this eclipse. It doesn't have to be fueled by rage. It comes from having seen enough, lived enough, and understood enough. So the question is still worth fighting for, and by simply become very good at fighting for it? Those are not the same things. There'll be time to figure out what comes next. Let yourself understand what you understand. And if something has become ripe enough to leave behind, let it go. As always, take what resonates, leave what doesn't, and give yourself some grace around the eclipse. As we get closer to the next one, I'll dive into it, but I'll return with something new and different next week. Until then, remember to find beauty every day and seek the magic in the mundane. Thanks for tuning in today. As always, take what resonates, leave the rest. Let whatever landed move through you in whatever way it needs to or wants to. And also, if you want to explore more, you'll find more information in the show notes. If this episode stirred something in you, please share it out or leave a quick review. It helps so much and I really appreciate it. And remember, this work is about integration and it always starts with self-trust.